Thank you guys for all joining us today. So in case you're wondering and wondering if you're in the right location, you are. We are going to talk about new books from urban science. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land that MIT sits on. I'm sure you guys are all in different locations, but MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Really excited to say on the behalf of the Urban Science Program, otherwise known as 11-6, and the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, the new books from our program. Super excited. If you're not familiar with the Urban Science Program, we started roughly 2 years ago. And as MIT's newest major, we provide foundation for students to work in applied computation, data analytics, public policy, economic development, urban design, management, and planning. But we have a particular focus on thinking about the ethical and responsible uses of computation in society, and always kind of thinking about those on the margins. Since the launch of the new program, we've had new faculty join and new researchers join, and all of us have launched new books in the last year. And so we thought this would be a great way to share kind of our vantage point on the department. What we thought we would do today is each one of us are going to give a very quick 5-minute overview of our book. And then many of you have submitted questions in advance. We had asked and made a call to many students in the program and students in the urban planning program to provide questions ahead of time. So we'll start by answering some of those questions, which I'll speak out loud. And if you were the person who submitted that question, please just give yourself a shout out or turn your video on. It'd be great to see you. And then we'll go to asking questions that we had for each other and things that we were really interested in learning about from each other's work. So I'll get us all started. Let's just shift here for a second. Bear with me. Today I'll be discussing my book, Data Action. I'm sorry, something has just gone wrong here. Whoops. Let me just try to make that go again one more time. Sorry, guys. There we go. I'll be talking about my book, Data Action. And, Data Action really started with the kind of premise that in the last decade, we've created unprecedented amounts of data. And in the next decade, the amount of data in the world is set to grow tenfold. And here we're looking at the data that's created by Google's autonomous vehicles. And while not all of that data is private, like the one that we saw before, with all the excitement from civic hackers to corporations and using that data, and even the development of a whole arm of Google dedicated to using it for civic action, I was left with a pain on my side about the ways in which many of these groups, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, were doing harm with all of this new data. And while my fellow academics were starting to sound the alarm, I really felt like we needed to create some way to tell my MIT students and other how to provide a corrective standard to practice. How can we use data for empowerment rather than oppression? And really, data action is set out to help data novices, urban planners, policy experts, and data enthusiasts think about the ways in which they may be intentionally or unintentionally doing harm, and think about ways in which they can use data more ethically and responsibly. And so part of what I do in the book is create what I call the data action principles. And I'll go through them quickly as we only have 5 minutes each. But first, when working with data, we must do no harm. So that means we must interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for our work to do more harm than good. Second, building teams to create narratives around data for action is essential for communicating the results effectively. And I think that's, anytime we want to work with data for policy, it's really important to have policy experts, people from the community and in the data, but also designers and architects who can communicate that information more widely. 3, we need to change power dynamics. Building data helps change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits, such as teaching data literacy. So if we can build our own data sets from the bottom, rather than taking ones that are coming from those in power, we can change those dynamics. 4, expose hidden systems. Coming up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must expose those ideas ethically, going back to the first principle, do no harm. 5, ground truth. We must validate the work we would do with data by literally observing the phenomena on the ground and asking those it affects to interpret the results. So that's really all data are people, and asking the people in the data if it represents their ideas and values. 6, share it. Sharing data is essential for communicating the need for policy change and generating a debate essential for that work. Data visualizations are really effective to do that. And I talk a lot about how using communication is a way to create action and policy change. 7, create ethical standards and remember that data are people. We must do them no harm, and we must seek to develop our own ethical standards. So here, I'm really thinking about the fact that we don't have enough standards of practice of the ethical use of data, both in terms of regulation, but other data that's coming online all the time happens much more quickly. And so reminding ourselves that we need to create our own ethics for working with data, and really going back to that first principle. So that is kind of a summary of data action, and it doesn't just talk about these 7 principles, but we use and illustrate the work of others who I think, uphold these principles. And I love to tell stories with data. And so you'll see a lot of great narratives inside the book. Thank you very much. So I will move it to our next author. And Catherine, are you ready to go? Okay, so I'll stop sharing.
All right. Just a second. Okay, hold on. Do you see that okay?
Yes, I see you. Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. All right, thanks. So super honored to be here. And it's great to be celebrating everyone else's new books as well. So I'm going to talk really briefly for 5 minutes about Data Feminism, which is a book that was just released also this year and the pandemic year. And this was a co-authored book between myself and Lauren Klein, and she's down at Emory University in Atlanta. And her background is as a historian, a literary scholar, and she's done a lot of work in the digital humanities. So that's, we joined forces on this book. So I'm just gonna explain a little bit about the motivations for writing the book. So really we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for making racist, sexist, and classist data products. And so many of you may be familiar with these things. There's many high profile cases. There are things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and many more things. And so we are not the first to be exposing these things. And in fact, the work that you see here at the bottom is a lot of the work that was inspirational for us as we were writing Data Feminism. And one of the, I think the things that we took inspiration from is that there is this growing pushback on what is essentially you could characterize as a meme that you see here at the top of this slide, which is data is the new oil. And this is like an old meme, and it has circulated for some time now. It was really first sort of invented by The Economist magazine, who had an issue about how data is the new oil in, I think, 2012. And at this point, so many people have said this and circulated this that you can go watch YouTube mashup clips of like, mainly men going like, data's the new oil, data's the new oil, data's the new oil. And, you know, of course, what they mean by this, they mean this in a positive way. And in fact, many of the metaphors that we use to talk about data are very similar to the extractive industry. So we extract, we mine, we clean, we process, and ultimately we, meaning The Economist and folks who are kind of endorsing this, turn around and kind of exploit these, this sort of raw, quote unquote, raw material for profit. But folks are pushing back on this, and the pushing back is coming from women of color who, and particularly Black and Indigenous women, from white women, from Indigenous people, immigrant communities, and many more folks who are saying data, in fact, is not the new oil, or maybe it is in the bad way of oil. And in fact, data is the same old oppression. It's just been accelerated and sort of exacerbated by our new digital, artificially intelligent systems. And, you know, I want to say that there's consequences for pushing back. And I just want to mention this high profile case that that has just come up. Dr. Timnit Gebru, who was hired by Google. She's done some incredibly groundbreaking work on bias in artificial intelligence. She was recently, just this week, fired from Google. First, her research paper was censored, and then she was subsequently fired. It's still a little bit unclear what the circumstances are, but in fact, it seems that Google just didn't like The fact that she was doing legit AI ethics and was releasing papers that were not entirely complementary of Google's own efforts in this space. And so I would encourage everybody on this call to go sign the petition that is in support of her and to stay tuned and follow this case, because I think it's a real moment of reckoning for AI ethics, or what sort of purports to be AI ethics right now. Okay, I'm running out of time. So real quickly, what we add to this conversation is a focus on feminism and feminist thought. And so we like to ground people in what is feminism, because people bring many kind of historic sort of baggage to this conversation around that word. Feminism at its root is a belief in equality. It's action to realize that equality in the world. So it's both a belief and it's action. And it's this tremendously rich intellectual heritage, like it's work and history that we draw on in order to confront new challenges of today. And the feminist work that we're drawing on is explicitly intersectional feminism, which is work that's been really developed by US Black feminism, including Kimberly Crenshaw, Combahee River Collective, and many more folks. And what intersectional feminism calls our attention to is not only women, it's even not only gender, but it's really about power. Who has power and who does not? And so maybe I will sort of leave it there, but basically the book Data Feminism proposes 7 principles for how we might ethically and in a feminist ethically way go about working with data, sort of navigating similar to Sarah's book and thinking about how do we navigate these biases and engage with and or possibly refuse to engage with these various systems from a kind of pragmatic standpoint. And so each of these principles corresponds to a chapter in the book, and we try to walk you through where the feminist thought comes from that would inform those concepts, as well as introduce you to folks who are already working in the world to realize these principles. And so maybe the last thing I'll say is you might note that there are 2 principles that have to do with power, and that's why the analysis, that's because the analysis of power and the challenging of power, the taking action against that power, that is the central thrust of the feminist project. And so that's a through line that runs throughout. So I think maybe I will stop it there and then hand it over to Andres, who is next going to talk about his work.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this up and full screen. Does the screen come through okay? Yep. Great. Thank you so much. And thanks, Sarah, for convening this conversation about 3 almost synchronous books in the department on various topics on urban science. My book is titled Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks. This book is about streets and retail stores, restaurants, vendors, service providers that often align important city streets. I suggest in the book that such streets, which we are so familiar with in our own neighborhoods, local subcenters, downtowns, etc., constitute an important interface between citizens and the city, and speak a great deal about how diverse, equitable, convenient, or livable a particular city is. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, streets aligned with commerce remain some of the most important spaces where we still have contact with the society around us. Yet planning literature has not paid a lot of attention to street commerce in the past, generally assuming that street commerce is a result of market forces that cannot be planned. So with little understanding of how street commerce operates and thrives, policymakers and planners can fail to intervene and support local main streets, which further struggle against fierce competition from planned shopping centers, as well as more recently from e-commerce and online deliveries. So in the book, I basically argued that good street commerce is part and parcel of building inclusive, diverse, and vital local economies, convivial neighborhoods, and sustainable built environments. From a social perspective, street commerce generates social ties that can grow into weak links or strong links, as Granovetter would say, and foster civic awareness, creating opportunities that go far beyond everyday consumption. Very few places in the city do that. For instance,
just so you know, we're not seeing your slides advancing.
I wonder why.
Maybe you're looking at a different screen because these are just not.
Can you see my second slide right now with the Boston and Los Angeles?
Yes. Yes. Now they're changing.
Okay. You know what? I'll just not do full screen. That seems to be the culprit sometimes. So as I was saying about the social benefits of street commerce, one study, for instance, in London by the Greater London Authority found that 51% of high street visitors, high streets is how people call main streets in the UK, were not currently in employment compared to the citywide average of only 25%. So this shows that high streets or main streets are far from merely spaces of simple consumption. They create social connections and job opportunities. They attract children and elderly alike, and they uphold and quite literally generate culture on the streets. From an environmental perspective, according to the National Household Travel Survey in the US, over 2/3 of all trips in cities are for shopping, personal, family, or social purposes. Amenity clusters, which are agglomerations of these retail, food, and beverage establishments and personal service establishments, play an essential role in this. And if they're accessible on foot or by public transit, they play a critical role in reducing urban energy consumption and CO2 emissions. From an economic point of view, small and locally owned stores have a much larger multiplier effect for local economic development than big box stores, for instance. Stores along city streets are more likely to procure and subcontract from other local businesses, hire local employees, have stronger commitment to the neighborhood, and so on. So in the book, I argue that if there is one good lesson from cities where street commerce has either been invented or reinvented successfully, or where forces of gentrification in neighborhoods have been equitably balanced, it is that successful street commerce rarely emerges or survives as a result of pure market forces. Planning on behalf of government, civil society organizations, community groups, or business associations is key to successful street commerce. What I find particularly interesting is that there is both a high degree of scientific regularity in the patterns of street commerce that we observe in cities, but at the same time also plenty of exception and uniqueness. Deviations from expected patterns that result from local geography, history, demographics, or community activism and conscious planning. On this slide, you see, for instance, the main clusters of street commerce in the Boston area. You may be able to outline Back Bay, Chinatown, but also places like Harvard Square, Central Square, and so on. And it turns out that there is a great deal of regularity and predictability in such patterns in most cities. For one, how many stores a metropolitan area can accommodate is rather accurately predicted by the population of the metro area. Just as one example here, the Washington, Arlington, Alexandria metro area has a population of about 5.6 million people, and the trend line here would predict that such a metro area ought to have about 46,000 street commerce stores. The actual number is 41,000. Second, individual establishments that collectively constitute street commerce also organize themselves into predictable hierarchical clusters. The well-known Zipf's law describes spatial patterns of street commerce surprisingly well. We typically find one dominant retail center, such as the Back Bay in Boston, and a number of more mid-sized clusters like Harvard Square or Assembly Row, and exponentially more little clusters like Inman Square and so on. And third, even how far these hierarchical clusters locate from each other is rather well explained by the spatial distribution of residents, jobs, and the infrastructure links that connect them. So this is the regular part of street commerce. But despite these surprising regularities, the pattern and character of street commerce is far from entirely predictable. Some cities punch above their weight in retail offerings than others, some below. Some communities have come together to organize around their main streets and squares despite the societal and institutional odds against them. The deviations and exceptions are precisely what makes street commerce interesting for planners. and illustrates the agency that community groups, civil society organizations, business associations, governments, or planners can have on fostering and cherishing their own streets and commercial clusters. So in summary, the book explores both the science and planning of street commerce, just like 11.6 in our program explores both the scientific and the normative, the predictable and the aspirational aspects of city building. Thank you. And I'll hand it off to Sasha.
Hi all, can you see my screen? It should be a full screen with just the cover of the book.
You can see it.
Great. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm here because I have this book with the MIT Press. It came out also during the pandemic, Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need. And in the book, let's see, can I advance? Yes. The book is an extensive reflection on a set of questions about the relationship between design, power, and liberation. And in particular, it's organized in sections around these questions. So what values do we encode and reproduce from the objects and systems that we design? Who gets to do design? What stories do we tell about how things are designed? What sites do we do design in, which are privileged and which are marginalized? And how do we teach and learn about design? And overall, design justice is, on the one hand, a framework for analysis about how the design of images, interfaces, objects, the built environment, socio-technical systems, really anything, influences the distribution of benefits and burdens between various groups of people. And design justice focuses explicitly on how design tends to reproduce, but could also be used to challenge what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins talks about as the matrix of domination, which is her term for the interlocking systems of oppression of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and you can add ableism, settler colonialism, and other forms of structural inequality. Design justice isn't a term that I created, so it's not just a framework for analysis. It's also a growing community of practitioners who are focusing on more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens, more meaningful participation in design decisions, and recognition of existing community-based indigenous and diasporic design traditions, knowledge, and practices. And so the community is made up of many different kinds of design practitioners who are working with social movements and community-based organizations across the United States and around the world. And many are affiliated with the Design Justice Network. The Design Justice Network was created at the Allied Media Conference in Detroit in the summer of 2016 at a workshop called Generating Shared Principles for Design Justice with a group of about 30 people that included designers and artists, technologists, community organizers, and others. And the goal of that workshop was to move beyond the frame of social impact design, human-centered design, or design for good, and to challenge designers to think more specifically about how good intentions aren't enough to ensure that design processes and practices are tools of liberation. And it's been growing ever since then, especially through the work of folks like Una Lee, Victoria Barnett, Wes Taylor, Denise Shante Brown, and many, many others. And the network is now organized with more than 1,300 signatories to the principles, more than 350 formal members, 11 local nodes that meet regularly in different cities, and working groups that focus on different tasks. You can learn more about the activities of the network over at designjustice.org. In terms of design justice and urban science, one of the first design justice local nodes actually formed in Toronto. And the first activity of the Toronto local node was a workshop, together with the Digital Justice Lab, focused on the Block Sidewalk campaign. So there was a broad coalition of housing rights and civil liberties activists who successfully blocked Sidewalk Lab's smart city plans in Toronto. And at that workshop, we learned about sidewalks history, and we explored what it might mean to have a truly consensual data flow within the so-called smart city. But there are many urbanists, planners, and architects who've been organizing and writing and developing practice that's deeply focused on design justice in the built environment. And in particular, the Designers Protest, or DAP Collective, which is co-organized by Black designers Brian C. Lee, Taylor Holloway, Mike Ford, Sonny Patterson, and Dee Nichols. And that group has been working to develop collective power to reverse the harms that the professional architecture and design fields have caused to Black people and communities. And in my last 30 seconds or so, I want to end with the specific demands from the DAP Collective. And then I hope in the conversation we can think about those in relationship to urban science. So first, design justice demands that cities and towns reallocate funds that support police and reinvest in the critical needs of disinherited neighborhoods and communities. A cease to all efforts to implement defensible space through SEPTED, since those efforts often criminalize Blackness under the guise of safety. Seizing support of the carceral state through the design of prisons, jails, and police stations. Redefining metrics for affordable neighborhoods by shifting away from the use of area mean income to determine affordability in communities, and instead rooting the distribution of state and federal resources in measures that reflect the extraction of generational wealth from Black communities. Advocating for policies and procedures that support genuinely accessible public realms that are free from hyper-policing and embedded oppression. Ensuring community self-determination through procedures that incorporate community voices in process and CBAs in action for all publicly accountable projects. And detangling contractual relationships with power and capital to better serve neighborhoods and communities from a position of service rather than a place of extraction and labor extraction. Preserving and investing in Black cultural spaces through placekeeping. And finally, design justice demands that we proactively redesign training and licensing efforts to reflect the history of spatial injustice and build new measures to ground our work in the service of liberating spaces. So I'll stop there because I'm out of time and hope that we can get into the conversation.
Great, thanks so much. Just like such a great, diverse, interesting body of work. I'm so glad we got to share it. So first, we had asked some students to ask questions ahead of time, so we have those, but I really want everybody who's joined us today to start adding questions to the chat. We'd love this to be a conversation, a debate, just to talk about all the different things that have been discussed here today. So please add your questions to the chat as we get to some of the questions that happened beforehand. So I'm just reading off the list that I got in order and as they came. And I think that in terms of our panelists, just if you feel ready to answer it, go for it. Right. So the first question that we have is from Natasha. Natasha, I'm not sure if you're here. If you are, would you like to ask your question in person? I don't see it, Natasha.
There is a Natasha. I don't know if it's the same Natasha.
It is me.
Okay.
All right, so for starters, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all of your presentations. I thought that they were truly delightful, and I'm really excited that you're all doing this kind of impactful research. It speaks very deeply to me. So, all right, I was wondering, to what extent do we as researchers have to modify our expectations around data science analysis and gathering when working in regions that do not necessarily conform to the culture and traditions of the global North or West?
I think that's a really great question, and I'll try to take some of it on. I do a lot of work on the African continent. And I think one of the biggest issues that I face is that there isn't enough data, and that because of it, the actors that are at play, the NGOs, the funding mechanisms, kind of various actors that work and operate in those regions, often don't address some of, let's say, some of the most important concerns, because perhaps they don't have the data, or maybe more importantly, they're using data and not realizing who's missing from it. And I think the World Bank and the IDP and others are starting to realize these missing data sets in a way. And, you know, it has become really an important component of the Sustainable Development Goals in the next decade. But I think that one of the things that we forget is that in the era of big data, there's much data that's still missing, and that missing data can potentially marginalize populations. Now, there's other questions revolving around, should we be using this data in the first place to respond to some of the development goals and others? But I think I'll just highlight that particular issue and then pass it on to my other colleagues to discuss. But I think it's a very big issue. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah. Oops. Sorry, Sasha, do you want to go?
Yeah, mine is really short. I just want to drop a link in the chat. I think this question is extremely important, and I'm really inspired by colleague Chelsea Barabas and a recent paper around the importance of studying up and applying algorithmic analysis and data science more broadly to those who are in positions of power, because too often the default position is to study marginalized communities. And so I'll just drop the link in the chat here, and I think that that's a really valuable conversation and one that urban science would benefit from a lot.
And the only quick thing I was going to add also was around, you know, I showed the thing of data is the new oil, and, you know, we can think about large, big tech corporations like Google, et cetera, as performing this sort of extractive work of kind of capturing data and then sort of converting it into profit. But I think in particular, if we're talking about academic research, we also need to understand how extractive the academic model of research has also been, and think about our work and our research related to extraction and vis-a-vis the ethics of the people we are studying and or working with and or something. Oh, what was I going to say? I had one other thing to say to that. Yeah, basically just a consideration of that work and of pushing back against that work, which actually is quite hard, because if we think about academic and scientific norms, there are norms that reward research papers, scholarly publications, and things like this, and don't necessarily reward work that's responsible and accountable to the communities from whom the data came. And so starting to rethink also some of those institutional models for why and how we value what we value. Oh, now I remembered what I was going to say. And you know, one of the things that feminism brings to the conversation always is this emphasis on who. So asking these who questions. So like, for whom is the knowledge? Who benefits? Who is harmed? That is really the sort of analysis of power that we have to do. And so if we're producing knowledge about the global South for the consumption by the global North, then that's a problem.
I don't have too much to add on the data collection perspective, but I agree with what's already been said. But I would highlight that this topic that I discussed around street commerce plays out in different forms in almost every corner of the world. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see how and why things manifest in particular ways. And in the book, I do cite different parts of the world. There are stories from post-Soviet neighborhoods in Estonia. There are stories from Indonesia and Singapore. There are stories from London and France and different places in the US. And as a researcher, I think one of the sort of key challenges is to try to understand these places well enough to understand what shapes street commerce and how street commerce is being used in each case. And they are quite different, but I think it does take a toll on us as researchers to really dive into the process and understand how local context and local norms oftentimes play out very differently and create still a recognizable pattern that is felt and seen in every culture of the world.
Thanks, Andres. I totally agree. I'm just thinking about how the design on Nairobi streets is so important, and kind of the number one cause of death is street crashes. So you're making a really important message about how streets are designed are important everywhere. Let's move to the next question. And this one is specifically towards Andres, and it's from Rat. Rat, are you here? Let's see, Rat. Although I have trouble navigating this, I don't see Rat, but just in the course of time, I'm going to ask the question, and if Rat appears, just turn your video on. So in your book, you mentioned macro trends such as the emergence of online retail, demographic shifts, flexibility of work location and hours that COVID has obviously exacerbated. How has COVID altered your view on successful commerce? Are there areas where your thesis has changed?
Yes, that's a great question. To put it very simply, I observe in the book two opposing trends that shape street commerce, especially in the US context, but globally as well. So on the one hand, there's a trend that has very strongly contributed to more street commerce, and that is the trend to re-urbanize. Especially in the coastal areas in the northern states of the United States, there's a clear statistical trend in both residential location choice and job location choice that people prefer urban environments again. And this is a sort of shift away from the post-war suburbanization. And in part, it's fueled by demographic change. So less nuclear families, more single-person households, more flexible schedules, and so forth. But at the same time, the emergence of e-commerce has sort of worked flatly against that. Now, COVID has massively increased the speed of e-commerce. So, for instance, a year ago, e-commerce was 11% of all retail sales. As COVID appeared, within a few months, it was up to 16%. So it was a very quick bump in how COVID contributed. And in fact, even sectors like restaurants, which were thought to be completely immune to online retail, now are no longer, because deliveries have become such an important part of restaurant business that's affected. But I don't believe that COVID is going to fundamentally change street commerce as we've known it. I think we're going to see a restructuring, and certainly many businesses are going to go out of business and restructure, or new businesses are going to replace them. But I think that the essence of streets functioning as community centers where there are social, commercial, cultural uses that line those streets is going to remain and maybe even strengthen. And one of the sort of silver linings that I see with COVID in particular is that COVID has sort of showed that we can be quite effective working from home and not necessarily go to office for everything. So it's actually given a boost to some of the residential retail clusters, which traditionally haven't had people around during the day. And I think even after COVID, we might see people continue some of the more flexible schedules and not necessarily be in the office all day long, which could translate into a benefit towards street commerce, where people might opt to be working somewhere during the day rather than being in the office.
Thanks. And Rat, I see that you've joined us. Hi. Sorry, I couldn't find you earlier. Thanks so much for your question. I'm going to move on to the next question. Amelia, are you here? And want to turn the screen on and ask your question? I don't see Amelia. I'm sure. I feel sure that Amelia was coming, but could be another technical difficulty. But I'll ask the question, and Amelia, if you join, please just turn your screen on. So Amelia asked, what is the main narrative your book challenges? How are we challenging the white urban planning field if everyone on the panel is white? So I think thank you for your question. And I'll open it up.
I think it was clear from the presentation, the main narrative data feminism challenges is this data is the new oil. I think it's all sort of contained in that meme. And I really appreciate Amelia asking this question. And I think it's something that we're starting to take action on as our kind of newly formed urban science group and program and in internal committee work. But I think she's pointing out a key challenge of working under this frame of urban science, which is that it's been mainly undertaken by white people and white institutions who need a high level of eliteness and sort of expertise. And so I think that's something that we, as an emerging sort of urban science trendsetter, can start to expand the frame out from. And it's a key area where I think we have work to be done. And we've started some of that work, and I think we need to chart a course to continue and to sustain and to maintain that work. And I don't think it's an accident that most of the people who are working in urban science are white. It's very similar to computer science, for example, of which urban science is a part. And so what it means that I think we have to do, and this is something we make a case for in data feminism, is expand the definition of what counts as data science and expand the definition of who counts as a data scientist. And if we expand that, we think about, well, like, what is urban science and who does urban science? If we expand that out from like people with PhDs or people in elite institutions or people with extremely large data sets, I think we'll see, and this is sort of something we point to in data feminism, is that some of the most exciting work today is being done by folks who are not within those more narrow definitions of the term. And I feel like that's probably what we'll also find with urban science as well. But I'm very curious to hear other people's answers.
Yeah, I'll go next. I love this question as well. I think that main narratives that design justice challenges, one is it challenges the idea that design for good, framed vaguely and with good intentions, is enough to help us dismantle systemic oppression. And another main narrative, which is in the subtitle, community-led practices to build the worlds we need, is it does exactly what Catherine's suggesting, which is challenging the idea or the definition of who is a designer and who counts. And so instead of focusing only on people with professional design degrees of different kinds, we have to think about a broader space of design as a human activity, lived experience as a valid component of that, and what it means to align and develop mechanisms for people who do have specialized knowledge in professional design fields to be able to actually effectively work with people who may not have those types of knowledge but have other types of knowledge. And in terms of the extreme whiteness of urban science, everything that Catherine said, in addition, I would say in terms of this panel in particular, so the framing of the panel, it was structured around recent books. And so we also need to think about well, who has access to positions in the academy, access to publishers, how does the review process operate? There's an extreme wealth of powerful knowledge and scholarship that's being produced both by Black scholars inside and outside the academy, as well as by practitioners and community organizers that are directly relevant to urban science and redefining what it means to manage information in city systems and so on. But they're not necessarily getting book contracts with MIT Press. And that could also be a site of contestation.
Yeah, thank you for the question too. And just briefly adding on to this, I think when we look at the presentations today, it also demonstrates that it is not only the job of marginalized communities to speak out, but it's also the job of all of us to address issues. And I think if you look at what each of the people presented today, there's a great deal of attention and a great deal of desire to counter dominant narratives or powerful narratives necessarily in the academic literature on data science, urban science, but also substantive areas. In my own area, when we look at street commerce, which is not necessarily focused on data per se, it just uses data to tell the story of a phenomenon, there's actually a lot of input, or really the exciting stuff that we've been seeing comes from marginalized communities that are dispowered or less powered around the world. And many of those that even in the literature, there's quite a bit of sort of original authorship, original thinking that is the most exciting stuff today. And I think it's the job of all of us to try to uncover this and to address issues that we find to be extremely important, as you point out. And so I think all of us are trying to do part of that and tell stories that counter some of these narratives. In my own instance, for instance, the sort of issue that street commerce is entirely structured by market forces is a concrete example that I'm trying to counter and illustrate the role that communities and activism, as well as local planning and ingenuity, can play in changing street commerce.
I won't spend a long time talking about this because we've heard a lot, but I think one thing that my book discusses is the framework of planning has, in America, at least, and in other places as well, was structured on racist beliefs and ideologies. And many of the technocratic planners who created zoning and land use regulations framed our field in that way. And I think one of the most important things we need to do is really come up with alternative frameworks. This is what our planners need to do right now in the way of thinking about how we manage our cities. So, the use of zoning to marginalize, the use of other kinds of data-driven tools. Let's, as Catherine said, let's really unpack, understand them, and then create new ways that counter it that are more inclusive. And I think while planners have been really great at critiquing themselves, we have not done a great of coming up with alternative strategies that planning departments can use and deploy. And I think that's our job. And I hope that through doing that, we make planning more inclusive and available to everyone. And it should be available to all populations. And that's part of all of your guys' job as urban scientists. I think you guys are just living at an excellent time. We're calling you to make planning more exclusive. We're calling you to make data powerful for all people. And we're calling you to make equitable cities and to question, why are all of us white? Thank you for doing that, because it shouldn't be the case. And we should think about all of us, how can we make a more inclusive field? And so I just want to perhaps leave us there because we're at the half an hour and we have other just really great questions. And I'm so sorry that we can't get to everyone's question. But I kind of do really appreciate the engagement that everyone has had today. So thank you guys for all joining us and to listening to our stories about our books, our beliefs, and what we hope to see for the future of this field and the future of planning. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for organizing, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thanks you guys for coming back for round 2 and making the time for it.
I'm glad we didn't get any bombing.
That was way better.
I wish it could be longer, but I just want to be conscious. I mean, I felt like we had other questions, but I just don't want to go over. I know everybody.